There we are. Thank you, Kim, for that very kind and warm introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to be back. It's been a couple of years, but I have always enjoyed presentations at these kinds of groups, and what I hope to be able to do today is to, as Kim said, lend some perspective, because I have withdrawn from the prediction powers that may or may not have come with my particular role. My crystal ball got cracked in 2016. It hasn't been fixed, and I'm perfectly fine with that. But what I try to do is, as an educator, to help people understand patterns, trends. I am a data geek, so you will see some numbers. But what I hope to be able to do is put today into some kind of context to where you can understand this evening how we got here and potentially, and I will not predict, but potentially where we go from here. So we are talking about a blue moon and or blue wave in the 2018 midterm election. And there are four kind of key points that I want to leave with you in terms of how political scientists, political analysts look at this year's elections. So first and foremost, midterms are typically always referendums on the president and the party in power. That has become a stay in terms of how we study congressional elections. And I'll give some more details about each one of these. The second point, the hyper-polarized partisanship that we are currently experiencing drives voter choice. And I'll give you some data about that as well. North Carolina's blue moon election, the last time we had this kind of election with no U.S. Senate, we don't elect governors in midterm years, was 2006. Different dynamic from then. And I'll talk a little bit about the congressional races where some of the ideas and concepts that we're studying about, and then a little bit about the General Assembly as well. And then finally, how big could this Democratic wave be, if any? And I think oftentimes, for even today at this particular hour, I'm still questioning, trying to figure out the answer to that question. So if you feel confused, if you feel overwhelmed, trust me, the polls close in about 7 hours. It will be done, then we will start 2020. But I will wait on that particular note. The first and most important point for most of us who study elections, the referendum idea. The referendum on the president and the party. And I want to go back to 1934, FDR's first midterm. You may not be able to see the numbers, but look at the bars. The bars indicate, the dark red bars indicate House seats gained or lost, and then Senate seats gained or lost. And you will see that basically in two elections, the president's party gained seats in both chambers. There was one year where the gain was in the House and it was even in the Senate. But for the most part, history tells us that the pattern is the president's party will lose seats in either or both chambers. And that's an important data trend that we look at as political scientists to try and start to put things into context. This gives you the House seats that were lost since Reagan's first midterm. And what I want to do is overlay it with presidential approval ratings. And so this line gives you the various levels of the president's approval at the time of the midterm. Ronald Reagan in his first midterm was sitting at 42%. In his second midterm, it went up into the mid-60s. But you see it bouncing around most recently in the George W. Bush second midterm and then Barack Obama in the low 40s to mid-40s. Compare that to how the House seats either won or lost. For the most part, House seats were lost by modern presidents. Only in 1998, when Bill Clinton was under impeachment, and then right after 9/11, 2001, the 2002 midterms, seats were picked up by George W. Bush and the Republicans. But for the most part, presidents lose seats in the House. Here's the same graph with the approval ratings and the Senate seats won or lost. Again, for the most part, presidents lose seats in congressional midterms. Now, what we're seeing this year is a distinctive map, and in fact, we are seeing two basically different elections going on, one for the House and one for the Senate. So if we're basing all of this on presidential approval numbers, here's President Trump since his inauguration in terms of presidential approval or disapproval. And he's actually sitting where Barack Obama was in his two midterms in the mid-40s, if you take the average of most of the polls. So the basic trend, sitting in mid-40s, the likelihood is seats will be lost by the president's party. But the Senate is different from the House this year. And for Democrats, they are defending many more seats, 26, to only 9 Republican seats. And so you can go about classifying these Senate seats into distinct categories. For Democrats, it's all likelihood. California, Washington, New York, Virginia, those are safe Democratic seats. You get into the likely Democratic seats, you kind of complete the Rust Belt section, Pennsylvania, Michigan, into Wisconsin. The two seats that are likely Democratic seats, Montana and Ohio, and then you get into the toss-ups, the competitive ones. And for Democrats, it's basically 5 states, 4 of which went strongly for Donald Trump 2 years ago. It looks like North Dakota with Heidi Heitkamp is going to flip, but the battle is going to be in Missouri, Indiana, West Virginia, and most importantly, in Florida again. Then you go to the Republican side. Republican toss-up seats, Nevada, Arizona, and Tennessee. Tennessee likely to stay Republican, but the wave could bring Phil Bredesen into office if it's big enough. That's a high hurdle to meet, but there could be a potential there. Everybody's focused on Texas, and in particularly the power of Beto O'Rourke to raise well over $75 million for one Senate seat. That seat will become the most expensive one when all is said and done. Texas, for a lot of analysts, we have been predicting Texas is going to change, it's going to evolve, it's going to switch, it's going to become competitive. And every election year, Texas votes Republican. It will happen, we're just not sure when. But this year, the dynamic is something Texans have never seen in terms of a U.S. Senate race. Then you've got the likely Republican safe seats. Mississippi actually has 2 Senate contests going on. One of them could go to a runoff in December, so that might be something to watch later this evening. On the House side, it's all about the generic congressional ballot. If you were going to vote today, would you vote for a Democrat or for a Republican for Congress? And over time, what we have seen is a consistent yet varying lead for Democrats on the congressional ballot. Right now, they're averaging a +7. That would be a pretty significant wave if that wave were to come through and hold on those lines. Charlie Cook is probably one of the most respected independent political analysts. His forecast today, about 50 more Democratic solid seats than Republican. But when you get into the likely and lean and the pure toss-up, all Democrats need are 24 seats to flip majority control. And that is already evident in the toss-up areas, several of which are in this state, and I can talk about that a little bit later. So referendums on the president, but we have, as we continue into this hyper-polarized world that we exist in, voter choice based on partisanship. And what I want to do is present some data from the American National Election Study in 2016, the last presidential election. And they asked the question, do you identify as a Democrat, Republican, or an independent? And then they asked the strength of your partisanship. Are you a strong partisan? If you're an independent, do you lean to one party over the other? Taking that data, I then looked at the responses for, well, how did all of these categories, strong Democrat, not strong Democrat, all the way over to strong Republican, how did they actually vote for their party's president? If you look at the strong partisans, strong Democrats and strong Republicans, 95+% for their party. Not surprising, because these are the diehards, the loyalists, the foam at your mouth, kind of rabid partisans that we have. Move into the less foaming at the mouth partisans, the not strong Democrats, not strong Republicans. 3/4 of them voted for their party's presidential candidate. Now, we all talk about the great independents, the mass of moderates that's going to save the country from itself. Well, if you ask independents, do you lean to one party over the other, most of them split fairly evenly down the middle. And in fact, when you ask them, an independent Democrat or an independent-leaning Republican, did you vote for your party's presidential candidate? They actually vote more for the party's candidate than the weak partisans. It's only when you get into the pure independents, less than 10% of the electorate, where they split their votes. So partisanship reigns. Another key signal that I look at. In the same survey, they ask, is there something that you like about your party, and is there anything that you like about the opposition? Strong partisans, strong Democrats, yeah, 85% of them said, there's something I like about my party. Less than 20% say the same thing about the opposition. On the Republican side, a mirror image. Now, when you start to move into the middle, the not strong partisans on Democratic and Republican move into the independent Democrats, the independent Republicans, almost mirror images of how each side sees itself and sees the opposition. So what about the independents? The folks that save us in the middle, do they like anything about either party? Nope. Less than 1/4 have anything nice to say about either party. So that's at the kind of the macro level. One of my research agendas is that I'm doing some work at the precinct level, trying to get down into the weeds of voting behavior. And I read a book several years ago, and I've assigned it to a class by Bill Bishop called The Big Sort. And he makes the argument that basically we have sorted ourselves into like-minded communities, we interact with like-minded individuals, we live in our isolated bubbles, and then when we meet somebody from the opposite bubble, we go, hey, he ain't from Mars, he's from Pluto, if it's still a planet, okay? So this idea of how we have sorted ourselves got me to thinking, could we see this play out at the precinct level? And so what I did was I applied it to the precincts by saying, if in a year's election, the statewide average for a party was, say, 49%, but a precinct voted for that particular political candidate at 59, well, that's a +10. Then in the next election, maybe it was even more of a spread. Precinct went 20. So I took the two elections, averaged them, and then classified them into, if it's +10 or greater, likely for one party. If it's kind of 3 to 10, well, it leans to that party. Less than 3, it's a toss-up precinct, kind of a competitive precinct. And then I color-coded. Dark red for strong Republican, dark blue for strong Democrat, green for competitive. And I did this for Rowan County, my home county. Here's Rowan County, and tell me if you can tell me where Salisbury and Spencer is. Look how few precincts, though, are competitive, are toss-up. Now, I can't come to Mecklenburg County and not show you Mecklenburg. So I go back to 2004, 2008, George W. Bush, Barack Obama's elections. Here's Mecklenburg County. The yellow lines are the city council districts for the city of Charlotte. Notice the north. Well, except for that blue splotch. Everybody knows what that blue splotch is, right? Davidson, those faculty. Oh. But you got the strong Republican North, you've got the strong Republican South, you've got this classic Republican wedge South part of the city of Charlotte, but deep blues, deep reds, few greens. Here's 2008, 2012, the Obama election years. Notice what changes. You start to see some modifications going on in the South, in the North. Things aren't as red in the North and in the South part of the county. 2012 and 2016. Compare 2004 and 8 to 2012 and 16 and focus on South Charlotte. The transformation going on there. That's something to watch going into the future. Polarized partisanship driving our vote choices, that's going to be evident this year in this blue moon election cycle. We've got 10 Republican congressional districts, 3 Democratic districts, but basically the nation is watching 3 of our districts, the 9th, the 13th, and the 2nd. And instead of showing you basic numbers out of those, I decided to look at one key statistic. How a district voted for President Trump in comparison to how it voted for the Republican congressional candidate. Now, for example, in the 9th, Donald Trump got 55% of the vote in the 9th congressional district in 2016. Robert Pittenger got 58%. So it was a fairly close connection. If you take all 13 districts, and for the stats geeks out there, it's a pretty close fit. In fact, you can explain 97% of a Republican congressional candidate's vote based on how that district voted for Donald Trump. The connection is there, and that's the thing I'm going to be watching tonight. If you take the state Senate, 35 Republican seats, Democrats hope to break the majority, supermajority status. If you do the exact same thing, line up the president's vote with the Senate Republican candidate's vote, 95% explanation. Now in the state house, 120 seats, 75 Republican, it's what we in statistics call a little noisier. There's a little more dispersion along the line, but still you're explaining 82% of the vote for a state house Republican candidate by how that district voted for Donald Trump. So in my mind, if the Democratic wave goes against the president's numbers, we should see a corresponding effect as well on these districts. Last, how big is this wave, if there is one? It feels like one. The generic ballot has one at 7. CNN had a poll to where it was 13 points, generic ballot. I think that's an outlier. But it looks like there is momentum over the weekend breaking, and typically what tends to happen is the break favors one party over the other. So if you look at comparing early turnout, 2 million early votes have been cast this year. And so for a comparison, here's 2010's numbers. Here's 2014, 10 days of early voting. And here's presidential year 2016. Now we thought it's a midterm year. It'll act like a midterm year with early votes. Yeah, not so much. We're actually closer to 2016 numbers of early votes than we are to 2014. That means turnout could break a record. And in fact, if you look at North Carolina voter turnout, you can pretty much ride it along in terms of looking at when presidential years are and when midterm years are. Because it's a nice up and down, up and down, up and down. Well, you get to 1990 with the Helms Harvey Gantt Senate race. That was a presidential level year. But in recent years, the last blue moon election cycle, 2006, 36% voter turnout. Folks, we already have about 30% of the 7 million registered voters in North Carolina having voted already through early voting. If you look at partisan turnout within these years, the key thing with the smaller bar charts are the midterms. Republicans, registered Republicans, typically always overperform and are the highest in terms of turnout in midterm years. Based on the numbers from early voting already, a third of registered Democrats have already cast ballots. 30% of Republicans, about a quarter of unaffiliated voters. Unaffiliateds will probably determine this year's election in that regard. 8 seconds. Boy, that was pretty good. So the 4 key points I would leave you with: a referendum in a hyper-polarized environment, a weird election, and it is a strange election year. This is unlike any midterm that I've seen in this state. And then tell me what the number is for the Democratic wave. If we have a few minutes, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Let's give Michael a round of applause. Thank you, Michael. Any questions, observations? Yes, please. Yeah.
I have a question about the sample size and how it comes into play. When I look back at some of the research that you guys have done in 2016, I would see that maybe 890 to 1,000 people were included in the sample sizes. Can you reflect on how is that a good size from a statistical standpoint, or is that just the accepted norm that you guys use in developing that sample?
I will say up front that I'm not a polling expert. I would defer to my colleague Scott Huffman at Winthrop University, who runs the Winthrop poll as the leading expert in the Carolinas about public polling. What I would say is, yes, 800 to 1,000 if you can get people to answer the phone and not block you is a representative statistical sample. What you generally tend to see are surveys around 500 to 600. And that's because oftentimes to get about 500 responses, you have to make 20,000 phone calls to get 500 people to answer. Now, there is also weighting that goes on. Maybe white men are overrepresented, maybe black females are underrepresented. There will be weighting done, but that weighting tries to predict what the electorate will look like. If you ask me right here and now, what is the electorate going to look like this evening? I have no idea, because it's all a guess. But in terms of the sample size and the approach that most reputable pollsters take, it is indeed statistically valid.
Great. Yes, Mary.
The question was about the rise of far-right parties in Europe, and could that potentially happen here in the United States, both far left and far right? First off, I would say I'm not a Europeanist. There are 2 types of political scientists. There are those that study the United States, and then there are those that study everybody else. I'm an Americanist. I've got enough crazy people to work with in terms of dealing with that. With that said, I think the rise of particularly the far-right authoritarian approach is something that is becoming more and more prevalent in European countries. And as it relates to the United States, back in the 1950s, a group of political scientists wrote a report that said there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and that the 2 parties should be different. They should stand for different things and give a choice to the voters. Well, guess what, folks? We got that. It's almost too much of a choice between the 2. This intensity of polarization, I wish I could say that it's going to change. The numbers that I see already with the new millennial generation and Gen Zs coming along, they are just as polarized as the other generations, except they are a center-left generation as opposed to baby boomers being a center-right. And so I think the country's dynamic is simply going to shift, but we are going to continue this level of polarization.
One over here.
The question was about election tampering and whether there should be concerns. Voter fraud is a minuscule documented issue. The concern that I have is about election administration. And that is, you will hear today that the North Carolina State Board of Elections is holding an emergency hearing today because paper ballots have been affected by humidity and are not being read properly. That's an administration issue. And that's the concern that I have in terms of what we should be aware of and concerned about when it comes to that kind of an issue.
Bob.
The question was about what are the issues that separate the two parties, because they have ideologically and changed all around. And it's hard for my students to understand that at one point there used to be this thing called a Southern Conservative Democrat, just as much as there used to be this thing called a Rockefeller Republican. So getting them to understand that dynamic. The way that I explain it easiest is take two issues, social issues and economic issues. Do you want the government involved, or do you want the government to stay out of it? On social issues and on economic issues. And the way that I present it is, for conservatives, they want the government involved in social issues, but to stay out of economic issues. For liberals, it's the exact opposite. Stay out of social issues, but get involved in economic issues. And so I think that helps students try and wrap their head around what does it mean to be a Democrat in today's environment? What does it mean to be a Republican in today's environment? But they have to understand the history of where those two political parties and the foundational ideas of, do we like power centralized or do we like power localized? And that's a core issue going through the parties as well.
Race real quick, and then Jerry. And Jerry's daughter. Actually, we're going to get Jerry's daughter to ask the question.
Okay. On racial issues, you know, the issue of civil rights is probably the foundational, fundamental shift. And I'm teaching Southern politics this year, and I went through the entire timeline of how both parties have basically evolved and shifted on civil rights. And one of my better students, after hearing about 2 weeks of me lecturing and discussing and them reading, came up with a very simple question. So was Barry Goldwater the most influential loser of the 20th century? I said, yeah, pretty much. Yes, ma'am. Okay. The key thing to know about a poll is that it's a snapshot in time. It's when we get that person to answer the phone and answer the questions. At that moment, that's what we know. Polls can fluctuate all over the place. What I recommend to my students is go to something like Real Clear Politics. They take all of the polls, do a simple average, and you can see where the trend lines are. If one is an outlier, it will be very obvious. But I think for stability's sake, what we have gotten into is basically taking the aggregate and the averages to then say, this looks like where the trend line is moving, but trends can do this, they can do that, or they could do this. And that's, to me, that's part of the beauty of being a political scientist. You don't know where this is going. How did abortion become the polarizing issue between the two political parties? Roe v. Wade and the rise of social evangelical conservatives who before 1980, actually in 1976, a majority of them supported Jimmy Carter. And then the transition to the Reagan coalition brought them in full square. And I think, again, it signals the idea of how do the parties look at government involvement on a social issue. Race, abortion, marriage rights, all of these things, you know, kind of get sorted into one camp over the other based on the idea of, do you want government involved in it or do you want government to stay out of it? And that's kind of how I make sense of how things play out.
Thank you, Michael. I
My
appreciate it
pleasure.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've survived yet another election cycle, and I thank you, Michael, for your wisdom today. There is a meeting of the Environmental Committee in Studio 1, the Foundation in Studio 2, and David Hare will be here next week, so please be wearing your Rotary pin, and we'll see you then. We're adjourned.